let's talk about work being optional. Do you want work to be optional? And then you start working backwards from there. If you're lucky enough to run a business in Australia, a lot of people can, if they want, they can make work optional at 50. There's this number around age 65 that's just ingrained in our system. We're not saying you retire at age 55. It's just if you want work to be optional 55, you work towards that. And then everything on top is complete cream on top, because you are then deciding to continue to work. You don't have to physically work if you don't want.
Hello and welcome to Transformation Unlocked. My name's Adrian. I'm your host, and I am super excited. Today we have Jordan here from Koda Capital. We have a mutual friend by the name of Brendan, who is the operations manager for Network Plumbing, and he connected us a little while ago. And here we are today having a chat, all things private wealth, how to retire with enough money to make sure you have a great retirement. And Jordan, over to you, mate. Welcome to the call. How are you?
Thank you for having me on.
Nice. Mate, look, we've already had a little bit of a chat off air, and this is such an important thing. I might start with what we were just chatting about offline, about the distinction when we come to coaching. Like obviously I'm a sales and business coach to help my home services or maintenance-based tradies make more money and make more profit. And that's great. But the thing that people don't understand is that is all about replacing what we call your active income, where you have to turn up and do the work, with your passive income. So what we say inside our coaching is that your business, right, or even your wages, for the guys that are listening that are earning good money on their wages, is to look to what to do, invest it to eventually one day not have to work. That's what this whole game we're playing. And it's great to be able to speak to someone like yourself with a wealth of experience, pardon the pun, about how this all kind of plays out, who to turn to. We've got a lot of excitement at the moment. There's a lot of businesses being bought in Australia as we speak. People are having what Sarah, my marketing manager, loves, a liquidity event. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. So mate, with that kind of framework and that basis, so how did you get involved with it? Where did it come from? Like, obviously you're at school and everyone goes, yeah, okay. Or not everyone, but a lot of people go, yeah, I've got to make money. Is that kind of where you've got some inspiration from some people at school or adults or parents, or where did that inspiration come from?
Yeah, it was from school. So, I don't kind of come from a family that talks about money. I grew up on a sugarcane farm in northern New South Wales, so in a place called Yamba, which is where my dad still lives.
Yep.
My dad was a mechanic by trade. My mum was a bank teller at the local Westpac bank. She then went on to establish her own mortgage broking business. So that was kind of where finances came into our family. But mortgage brokers are people that help you essentially buy property, get access to funds from a bank. But all of the other planning elements certainly was not in our family, wasn't part of my mum's background, but she did work with a local financial planner. So he would come around and part of that process when my mum was helping people get access to debt to buy property, the conversation would naturally flow to say, okay, so the next step from here is, in the event something happens to either of you, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, if you couldn't work, you need to have insurance in place to help protect your income first and foremost. Or if one of you, a major event was to happen, one of you got cancer, one of you passed away, we want to have a lump sum of money that can help extinguish the debt, because you're going to be relying on one person's income as opposed to two. That's what got me into the world of understanding what financial planning was. That's just one element to it. So that's personal insurance planning or risk protection. The wealth planning side came by, during high school, I studied both economics and business, and then I went on to university. I did a double major in finance and financial planning, but effectively I fell into it. So at school, everyone says you go and study finance because you go and get a job at a bank or an investment bank or what it may be. I didn't really have anyone coaching me to say that's what I needed to do. I just always had a fascination with wealth and money because those conversations weren't exactly happening in the household. And then during university, I did a elective 1 year as part of my finance degree, and I learned about investing. I learned about superannuation, retirement planning, risk protection through insurance. And I just thought to myself, these are the things that everyone needs to know. Whether you go down that pathway or not, it doesn't matter. Yet these things aren't actually being taught in school. So when I got told that, financial planning was an actual major that I could do as part of my degree and supplement it with finance, I jumped at the opportunity, and lo and behold, second year of uni, I went into professional services. So I started working in wealth firms on the Gold Coast and then up in Brisbane as well. And I did that for 5 years on the Gold Coast. And, to relate it back to your audience, that's where I did my apprenticeship. I then moved to Sydney 10 years ago as of this month.
Wow.
And then started working in the big smoke and kind of getting exposed to different types of clients, different sums of wealth. Did some additional study off the back. So I've done about 8 years study now, which has effectively been the bane of my existence because I feel like I never stop.
Yep.
But here I am now. So
lovely.
I work at a business called Koda Capital. I have my own equity here in this business. I've been here 5.5 years. We're now Australia's largest privately owned wealth firm.
Fantastic.
We advise wealthy individuals, business owners, non-profit organisations. We collectively oversee about $15 billion of client money across those clientele. Got 4 offices, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, 160 staff, and the list goes on.
So if anyone's listening and they're about to have what we called earlier a liquidity event, we know who to speak to now. This is a good start, mate. Fantastic. I want to unpack a few. Yeah, nice. I want to unpack a few things. It is so interesting of what I see. In fact, we use this in our smart sales system. So it's a system that we teach tradies how to sell honestly, ethically, and morally. And we talk about beliefs around money. And it's really interesting that the way society is geared about family, we don't talk about money at the table, or we don't talk about money at all, or even the things that when you start to really pay attention, like the words filthy rich, like where the hell did this language come from? Like it is such an important thing to understand that wealth creation is an absolute necessity, I believe, as a parent, as a father, as a mother, whoever's listening, as an individual. Like that's the way that we look after and protect and look after our family. So I find it really fascinating around the language that we're taught, especially as tradies, and it could be across the board. Maybe my perception or my reality is the tradie world. But what can you add to that around what families and money? And do you find a distinction between people that are done well and then feel a bit embarrassed about it? Or have you seen stuff in your friends and family and your own life where the beliefs come in and play a big, maybe a negative role, maybe a positive role? Can you add to that?
Certainly, and obviously it's at different levels of wealth. Like I find, my upbringing, like I said, we didn't really talk about it. It's more openly spoken about now, especially with my father. He just retired the middle of this year. So the past couple of years and the lead up to retirement is the first time that my dad has started talking about his own, personal wealth plan, because he's getting advice, but he's wanted me just to kind of check off on the advice to make sure that it's sound. And, he's just wanted to bounce ideas around. But what I've found with the different people that I've worked with over the years, it sounds a little bit funny, but the level of wealth as you start to go up the scale, what I find is wealthier people tend to talk about money a lot more. It's certainly not taboo, because that's, a lot of them want to help one another. And for whatever reason, I don't know what the reason is, and these people aren't necessarily brought up in families that talk about wealth. They don't necessarily come from wealthy families themselves, but more often than not along the way, as they start to develop wealth, and to your point before, if they have a liquidity event, they typically have people in their corner that are talking about these things. And, we say in our world, like, follow the money. More often than not, if you're dealing with a wealthy individual, they also have wealthy friends.
Absolutely. And look, it's funny. I always say this on every single episode. We love this podcast, not just to be information. We love it to be a coaching session. The first takeaway, the first coaching lesson for today is, if you're hanging around your friends and you're not talking about how to grow your assets or grow your wealth or grow your money, and it's more about spending, maybe it's time to have a bit of self-reflection about the conversations you're having with your mates and seeing if you can be the change that you want to be. Talk about, how do we make more money? Is it okay? Like some people, the tall poppy syndrome kind of does live and breathe in Australia, but doesn't mean we have to make it something that we live by. So how do we go and start to change it? How do you change that, right? And obviously that starts with being more, I guess, happy for your friends when they have a good event. When they win, be their cheerleader. I think that's definitely something to take away from what we've discussed so far.
Completely agree.
Tell me, mate.
That's that common saying around birds of a feather flock together.
Okay, so part of what we also talk about in coaching, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call today, we talk about replacing your active income with your passive income. And look, I could be completely out of date. I'm not a financial expert, but I do obviously look after my own financial affairs. And again, I would never, ever give financial advice because I'm not licensed to. And my rough rule of thumb was always, if I want to retire on X amount of revenue, like a salary, I need to have that amount times 5% as basically my return. So, for example, if I wanted to get $150,000 a year, roughly I need $3 million of unencumbered, which means debt-free assets, to get $150,000. Is that still true? Am I miles off? Educate us, Jordan. Tell us what the number should be, roughly.
We use 4%. So you're pretty damn close. But, this is a concept as well that, I was having this conversation with a client who actually called me before the podcast, and she was wanting to take additional lump sum out of her portfolio, and she was highly educated, but a sweet lady. And she just said, is this going to ruin things for us if we take this money out? But we're brought up to think in that way, that, you have to generate you have to have a pool of assets that generates your 5%, and then you never touch the capital base. And that's when we're working. We've constantly got income coming in that we can spend. But when people then go and retire, whether that be at 40, 50, 65, 70, the reality is that you've worked your whole life to actually enjoy your money, that you shouldn't feel scared about spending down that capital base. Now, we're not advocates to say, hey, go and spend 10% of your entire net wealth year on year, because you certainly will run out of money. But there's a bit of art and science to it, that yes, financially you want the numbers to work, but at the same time you want to live your life. You don't want to be controlled by your money in a way that, if 100 grand is the number and then 1 year you're spending 120, 150, 160, whatever it is, you need to be more in control of your money, that doesn't concern you. Because the reality is when people retire as well, there's a concept called the retirement smile, which is essentially you start up here and your spending's a lot higher to begin with in the early years of your retirement, because you retire, all of a sudden you've got this big pool of capital. You want to go on holidays, you want to treat kids, you want to treat yourself to nice things. So you tend to spend a little bit more. But then, as you get deeper into the years of retirement, you may not want to travel as much anymore. You may not be as healthy and able to get on a plane and fly 24 hours across the world to Europe anymore. But then you come out the other side, where healthcare costs start to creep in when you're at a certain age and your expenditure goes up. So to kind of come back to your point, we use a rule of thumb around 4%, but it's not a hard and fast rule. We still want our clients to enjoy their money at the same time. Our role is just to essentially keep them in check, that if year on year they're spending more and it's going to damage their portfolio, we just quite simply, we talk about it here a lot, the emblem or animal that essentially, if you come into our meeting rooms here, it's scattered across all of our meeting rooms, is an elephant. And we use it to say we're here to address the elephant in the room. So we want to have hard conversations with clients when they're needed, but at the same time, we're not here to tell you what to do and how to spend your money, but we're here to coach you.
I love that. So in a perfect world, and again, I guess there's no hard and fast rule, but should we start considering retirement from the day we start working? Is that, the earlier you start, the better off you're going to be. It would make sense to do that. I know it can be a bit unrealistic for a 20-year-old to even have the concept of retirement. When would you start?
Well, naturally, right? Like in Australia, we've got a great retirement system here that if you're working for someone, they have to pay what's called super guaranteed contributions on your behalf, or SG. And that's at 12% of your salary. So call it, if you're earning 100K, your employer has to put away $12,000 into your retirement account, your nominated account. So it's already naturally happening in the background. Unfortunately, for most people, that's not, if they rely on that alone, that's not enough to get them through. So that's where you have to, at a certain point, start thinking about making additional contributions to your fund. For most people, like what you said, if you're 30, people's priorities are very different. So at 30, people are thinking about, or they've just got married, they're thinking about buying a home, they're thinking about, kids and schooling costs. Life's expensive. So for those people, depending on what you earn, tipping additional money into superannuation when you can't access that money until age 60 isn't for everyone. If you're on a high wicket or high income, it certainly can make sense to do what we call top-up contributions. So you can put in up to $30,000 each year into your super fund, which you get a tax deduction for. So that money that you put in, depending on what you earn, for the average person, so if you're earning less than 250K, it's taxed at 15% going in. In Australia, if you're earning above $190,000, every single dollar of income above $190,000 gets taxed at 47%. So there's a tax arbitrage there that if you can add little bits and pieces into your superannuation fund, whether it be 10 grand, 15 grand, and get a tax deduction and only pay 15% as opposed to 47, there's a tax saving there of 32%.
Absolutely.
So then it becomes a lot more, I would say, important for people when they're getting towards the back end. But it's so hard because there's no hard and fast rule. Like money and the amount of money that you make is...
Yeah, the sooner the better. Like if you're listening and you're listening to this and you don't know what's going on, I think the sooner you put a plan to it, even if it's small, I think the better off you're going to be. It is not like, and again, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's obviously property cycles, economic cycles, etc., and you need a certain amount of economic cycles in order to actually, in actual fact, we didn't even talk about that before, but you get what I'm saying about the economic cycle. You get your booms and your busts, and you need to have a few of those in order to get to your retirement number. So if the earlier you start, the easier it's going to be for you. Would you like to add to that or talk to that point?
Of course, but super is a great environment as well, purely from the tax arbitrage. So if you're investing on the outside, but you're paying 47% versus investing the same amount of money in your super fund, and you're paying tax at 15%, your money, just say you earn the exact same return, it's going to compound at the exact same level. But the leakage, depending on which investment vehicle that you use, the leakage in tax can result in a lot lower number come age 60, 65 than investing through your super fund. But to your point before, like something that we talk about a lot is, and I've used the word retirement here, you've used retirement, that can be a scary concept for a lot of people. So we actually like to pare that back and just say, get rid of that word altogether. Let's talk about work being optional.
Ooh,
so at what age do you want work to be optional? And then you start working backwards from there. And the reality is you deal with a lot of clients in this space, we do as well, that if you're lucky enough to run a business in Australia, you've got, decent profit margins. If you're kind of pulling out 20 to 30% profit on the business, that's a very healthy return. A lot of people can, if they want, they can make work optional at 50. They can make work optional at 55. There's this number around age 65 that's just ingrained in our system that a lot of people think that's when I have to retire. But we're not saying you retire at age 55. It's just if you want work to be optional at 55, you work towards that. And then, everything on top is complete cream on top because you are then deciding to continue to work. But you don't have to physically work if you don't want.
I love that. That's very cool. I love getting rid of that. It's actually funny. It segues perfectly to my next question about language and how words create our world. And something we were talking about after Sarah met up with you prior to the podcast is about language and learning about, and we do this in our business coaching when it comes to, if you don't know the language of business, and in your case, the language of wealth, therefore it becomes hard to go and create a world of wealth, or in my case, a world of business. So something that we've done ages ago is created an asset saying business terms. If you were to start to look at, and I think one of the ones that Sarah really liked the other day when you caught up was the liquidity event. If you were to start to look at different terminologies, I know some business owners, they might be exceptionally smart and fantastic at business, but then they start having a financial conversation and they might feel a little bit vulnerable or even self-conscious that they're not understanding the terminology. What would be the best way to, podcasts could be one of the ways. How would you start to learn the language of wealth?
It's a really good question. Yeah, podcasts, reading. The reality is for a lot of our clients, it's by having a relationship with us. And part of our role is, a lot of people get scared when they kind of come into a meeting because they think, I'm going to be out of my depth. But how I look at it is if I can't break down those concepts and communicate it to you in layman's terms, that's my issue, not your issue. We deal with a lot of highly intelligent people, whether they be doctors, lawyers, specialists, professions, even, business owners that have been incredibly wealthy, farming families that have generated mass amounts of wealth from selling the family farm. They might be highly intelligent in their one area, such as, let's call it agriculture for that last example. And they can tell you everything there is to know about agriculture, water rights, farming, but, what we do isn't their world. So for us, it's all about bringing it back to who's sitting in front of you. I work with guys in private equity as well. They're super sharp, super sophisticated. But when we talk about building and constructing, we call it an all-weather portfolio. So to your point before, an investment portfolio or an investment strategy that can survive and thrive through all economic cycles. not just when times are good, not just when times are bad. We want to generate a consistent return throughout. For those people that I was mentioning before, the guys in private equity, a lot of their money's tied up in the individual businesses that they're investing in on behalf of investors. But whilst they're super smart, super sophisticated, they wouldn't know the first thing about building a fully diversified all-weather investment strategy. They stay in their lane and they're focused in their one thing. Likewise with property developers, more often than not, they make their money over time through property developments. Like business owners, a lot of the time, all of their money or all of their wealth is tied up in their operating entity. It just comes to a certain point in time where they then have to start looking at, making their strategy more defensive than relying on the one thing.
No, I love it. Awesome. Tell me all weather, like I've heard on the internet, so it must be real, right? Some of it is factual. America, all-time record debts, $37 trillion. Bubble on the stock market, bubble in property. Again, the best way to sell newspapers or news is with fear. Something that helps as well.
Spot on.
How do we, again, with an all-weather portfolio, how do you allow for corrections or even worse, recessions and so on? And obviously, if you're getting to the back end of your working life, that's going to be more challenging. If you're at like 25, that's not an issue because you'll get an economic cycle where you come back up again. How do you create an all-weather portfolio for someone that's maybe a bit older?
I would start by saying, once again, addressing the elephant in the room is that, naturally in your investing journey, you are going to experience these corrections no matter what you do. If you sit in cash, there's a risk of that. And that is inflation, or the cost of living outpaces the return that you're getting on your capital sitting at the bank. So there's risks in anything that you do, and you've just got to be aware of that you're going to experience those types of risks in your investment strategy, no matter what you do. But that's how you generate returns, right? By taking on a level of risk. We just want to be sensible and smart about it. So we don't want to put all of your money in international shares, or call it the S&P 500, which is the US market, because there is risk associated with that. There is a high level of risk just investing here in Australia in the big banks and miners, because they're very cyclical, particularly your mining stocks. So we want to have a little bit of the portfolio, call it, depending on what we call the individual's risk profile. So we do a lot of work up front where we put them through a questionnaire. We sit down with them and we talk about, what's your expected return? How much liquidity do you need to have in the portfolio? Liquidity meaning how easily something can be bought and sold and converted into cash to get your money back, because there's a concept called the illiquidity premium. So you can earn a return or a higher return by giving up some liquidity.
Yep.
So once we go through that questionnaire and we determine what level of risk the client is comfortable taking in their portfolio, and we match it with the expected return as well, because you can't say to us, look, I want a 10% return and I want to take on zero risk. It just doesn't exist. There's no investment that will give you that. So once we work through that, it's about building a diversified strategy. So we invest, so we're fortunate enough here based on the investment opportunities that we get access to. We're not just investing in equities or Australian shares, international shares, and bonds or fixed interest. We're spanning a client's whole portfolio across things like private equity, which is when you're going out, you're buying private businesses that aren't listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, meaning they're harder to access. We're also investing in unlisted or private infrastructure assets. So that might be, in our portfolios, we have exposure to Sydney Airport, Brisbane Airport, Melbourne Airport, railroads, ports. So things that can continue to generate healthy income, but they're super defensive when markets go through corrections because they're not on a listed exchange. So what moves markets is, call it investor sentiment or investor behavior. And that's just quite simply when people are buying more, markets go up. Naturally that, share prices follow earnings growth in the underlying companies, but not always the case. Sometimes share prices go up for no reason whatsoever, and not because they're generating more money, it's because more people are just buying and pushing the price up. Likewise, when we experience shocks like in 2008, the GFC, or COVID in 2020, markets sell off because there are more sellers in the market than there are buyers. So in those listed markets that are liquid, a lot of people can experience or have a negative experience because markets, when they're liquid, they move fast. So we want to make sure that we've got a highly diversified portfolio across a lot of different asset classes, thinking about what your income needs are, thinking about how much growth you need out of the portfolio, but not just betting on Australia, which makes up 2% of global markets. So we're a tiny market here, and not just betting on the US, which is, quite tech heavy.
Yeah, I love that. Like, I don't know if the listeners remember NFTs were going gangbusters and everyone loved them, and there was no substance in them whatsoever because, and I was just about to Google it, but I thought, I'm sure you probably heard of the tulip thing in Holland. I think it was the 1600s or whatever. Tulips became the rarest commodity on the planet. And it also, and again, just recently we've got, I've been in gold and silver for about 6 years now, and the most funny thing was that they were interviewing people that were buying gold and silver in the last few months as they were lining up in Martin Place. And they
in Sydney.
Yeah, it was nuts. And they'll go, why are you buying it? Oh, because it was on the news.
Yeah, correct.
They go, wow.
They call that herd mentality, right?
What an investment strategy that is. But yeah, like that's a really, really fascinating point. So, and I must admit, I wrote down another note here. I heard you on Equity Mates with Crypto Bros, and they get all excited about what the coins are going to do and whatnot. And again, I'm personally not knocking crypto. There's definitely a place for it, I would assume, in a balanced portfolio. But to think that if you have everything in one egg in one basket, I would say that's probably a risky move. Would that be correct, Jordan? How would you approach people that are either full on into crypto or someone that's heavily into, myself, gold and silver? But that's not my only asset class, but I'm definitely very focused on that. How would you, again, this is not advice, of course, but how would you kind of have a conversation around that?
Well, what we see is the exact same, whether it be in those types of investment assets or if it's someone operating their business. A lot, like people when they're in their accumulation phase, tend to take a lot more risk because, it's that classic get rich quick scheme. People don't actually know their numbers around what they need to live on, what makes a good life for them. And more often than not, they take a huge amount of risk for a long period of time. And for a lot of people, that pays off. Like if it's in your business, a lot of my clients are in business for themselves, and that's where they've made all of their money. Sometimes people, it's investing in residential real estate, commercial real estate, and they make all of their money there. But the reality is for a lot of people, once again, that we deal with, once they come out the other side and they have an exit and they've taken all this level of risk for a long period of time, they walk away with a big pool of capital. They actually swing the other way and they say, okay, I understand. I've, done very well. I had a great business. I was making 20% per annum returns. Now what the mandate is, give me a 7% return, but just don't blow up my money. It becomes, so the strategy shifts
protection
from excessive risk taking to capital preservation. So to your point around how do you have this conversation with some people, really depends on their stage that they're at. And it's not just an age thing, meaning you don't hit 65 and then all of a sudden say, okay, now it's time to switch off risk and I want to go defensive, which the traditional financial planning model will tell you that you have to take more risk early on. And then, at a certain point, you have to de-risk. We've got guys and girls that will have an exit at 40 and their mindset dramatically shifts because all of a sudden it becomes less about them and then it becomes about future generations. And I want this money to last not just for me and my wife, but I want it for my kids and I want it for my kids' kids, because we're fortunate that we've now generated, this huge pool of capital, and I don't know what to do with it. It was very easy when it was all tied up in my business and, the business was making a few $1 million a year. But now if I've walked away with 20 million bucks, 30 million bucks, 50 million, how do I actually generate an income from a non-productive asset? Like the money's sitting in cash now. What do I do with it? And I don't want to go and make a silly mistake where I blow up the money, because we also see that a lot. Is, Sarah and I were having this conversation that I'm most effective pre-exit, not post-exit. And it depends on, I guess, how close in proximity it is in post-exit that I get introduced. A lot of the time, an accountant will bring us into the meeting when they're having the conversation with the client around exit planning. But if we see people that have had, call it 2 to 3 years post-exit, and they've had the money themselves and then they come to us, more often than not, they're telling us all their goals and ambitions, but they've gone and locked away, call it 60% of the money in commercial property, or they've gone and invested in a really good private equity fund. So this happens a lot. Like if they get bought by private equity, they will then go and tip 50% of it back into that private equity player. Not saying that individual private equity manager, that private equity funds, that commercial asset, that residential property is a bad investment. But we really want to work with clients to strip it back and say, maybe it's not a good idea to have 60% tied up in one strategy. How do we make it more defensive? And if you've gone and locked away that money and then come to us and you have to reverse that, sometimes you can't reverse it, or it becomes very costly to unwind it, especially from a tax perspective.
You may not be able to with
costs.
some arrangements. They might say you can't sell until we exit. Yeah, absolutely. Or have a liquidity event. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where the planning element's like really important, is to sit back and actually say, what do you want? One of the questions that we ask is, what is the purpose of the wealth? And that question, may come out and people say, you know what, it's hit the point where it's all about my kids now. We've got well and truly enough money to last us. But, Sydney's an expensive place to live. I don't want to see my kids have to move away from us in Sydney because they can't afford to live here. We want money left to help get the kids into the property market. These are, conversations.
Absolutely. Especially like the way it goes, and what's it going to be? Like my kids are 15 and 11, so it's going to be a hell of a lot more expensive than it is now. So I mean, there may be a correction of some sorts, but yeah, you've got what you need today is not what you need tomorrow. is pretty much it. You touched on a term there. I want to dig a bit deeper. Accumulation phase. I've definitely heard that before, but I must admit I don't know the other phases apart from. I don't know the terminology. And this leads back beautifully to that language piece we talked about a moment ago. Accumulation phase is one of them. What are the other phases or other kind of labels that you would put around your going from the beginning all the way to the end of your whether or not you want to work?
So accumulation start there. Accumulation just means growth phase. So you're building your wealth. At a certain point, depending on who the individual is, you will go into then the next phase, which is, and this terminology stems from superannuation. So in your superannuation environment, it's literally called accumulation phase. Then you can flick the switch at a certain point in time. Typically, it's age related. So once you're over 60 and you've retired, you can switch your superannuation money to what we call pension phase or drawdown phase, where you're actually getting access to the money and you're spending it. And that shifts the tax environment. So instead of paying tax at between 10 to 15% in accumulation phase inside super, that's why superannuation is so attractive, and a lot of people don't know this, and that's why you need to have a strategy to build wealth there, is it's the most tax-effective vehicle available to every single Australian. Because once you go into drawdown phase or pension phase, when you're drawing on the money, you actually pay 0% tax on any income that gets generated, any capital gains, up to a certain threshold. So the government's started to tinker with this more, of course, but now it's $2 million that you can have in pension phase where you're paying 0% tax on your money. There's no other vehicle available to everyone where you pay 0% tax. Doesn't matter if the money's in a company, a trust, doesn't matter.
And look, I get pretty passionate about these points. We often say, we have a taxation problem in Australia. No, we have a government spending problem in Australia. Like if we could spend the money so much smarter, like it really annoys me how the working class as well as the business owners get quite hammered when it comes to taxation. It is really a pain point for myself. But anyway, I won't rant on that today. But tell me also too, self-managed super funds. Okay, I know it's so difficult for you because we're talking in general terms. We're not talking about any one individual's circumstances. So I'm very aware of that. Is it something, business owners probably would, again, on general rules, again, we're generalizing, this is not advice. Would it be correct to say that maybe business owners should be leaning more towards a self-managed super fund and employees probably not? Is that a bad blanket rule?
No, I would say there's no blanket rule. You'll hear this a lot and you've touched on it there. The common response to a lot of these questions is it depends, because it really depends on the individual. At a certain, you need to have a certain level of money in your fund for a self-managed super fund to make sense, because we talk about, after tax returns, after fee returns as well when we're talking to clients. To operate and run a self-managed super fund costs more money than having your money in, say, what we call an industry super fund like Australian Super, which is Australia's largest public superannuation vehicle that you can access. So your accountant charges you for an ongoing tax return and an audit each year, which means you have to have a certain level of money to make it worthwhile. So typically, as a general principle, it's north of $500,000. So we've got, plenty of clients that work in professional services that might get, say, they might be in sales, they're high income earners, or they get stock options for working at Google or Facebook or Amazon or whatever it may be, that, they've got large sums of wealth, not just people in business. Where you see a lot of business owners with self-managed super funds. So one of my clients, for example, he's a specialist surgeon and he owns his practice through his self-managed super fund. And effectively, you have to pay rent for that. But he's pretty much gets the ability to own an asset inside his super fund. He has to pay rent at market rate, but he's effectively just paying himself the rent. So it becomes a really effective vehicle.
Yeah, very common for plumbers, electricians, fridges as well. We did the same thing with our warehouses.
Yeah, spot on.
Nice, thank you, mate. We're getting close to landing the plane, so to say. So I'd love to do two things. I'd love to, first of all, kind of summarize what we discussed, but also to make sure that everyone knows how to get in contact with you. We'd love to get you back again, like we chatted about, in about 6 months thereabouts, because wealth creation is so important to what we talk about in coaching, and it's the end goal about replacing that active income with passive income. And if we could leave the listeners with, say, 3 points, it could be less, as long as we can leave them with a couple of actionable, tangible points that they could leave the podcast today with something that they can start to do to increase or to start to think about their wealth creation.
3 things. Okay, that's put me on the spot. I'd say, to give you the biggest bang for your buck, number 1 would be, and this sounds so simple, but sit down with your husband, your wife, and actually write down what your asset position looks like at the moment. Most people don't know what that looks like. So it might be, male partner, for example, he knows where everything is, but the wife, a lot of the time, may not.
I'll interrupt you, because if you're one of my coaching clients, we help you do that. Because I'll forget. But yeah, please continue on. Yeah, excellent.
So write that down. That's, a simple exercise. Crack out a bottle of wine with your husband, your wife, sit down at dinner together and have that conversation. At that same point, so point number 2 is actually have a conversation together as to where you want to go. You need to have a goalpost that you're actually aiming towards, call it your North Star, because there's no point, aimlessly just keep doing your thing and then you hit 55 or 60. And I have this a lot with people. They reach out and they say, typically what the trigger is the kids leave school. They say, we're done paying school fees. The mortgage is almost paid off now. We want to retire ASAP. And more often than not, you have to have the conversation to say, what do you want to spend? What do you want your life to look like? And they haven't done the right steps up until that point where, I'm having to have difficult conversations to say, with some people, not everyone, but some people, it's you either have to readjust your income, how much money you want to spend, or you need to work longer to accumulate more assets. Or most frequently here in Sydney, paid off the big house, but it's what we would call a non-productive asset. Yeah. It's not generating you any form of income. So you have to sell the Sydney home and move elsewhere. And some of these people, they're sitting on $5 to $10 million in real estate, which seems like a no-brainer to most people. But when you've lived in the area, you know your neighbours, your kids are still in Sydney going to university. A lot of people don't want to uproot their lives and move away from their family and friends. So it's a really hard conversation to have. So have that conversation around where you want to go. And then third, I'd say reach out and have a conversation with a professional. We don't typically charge for an initial consultation. So sit down and have a conversation with someone to see if you can actually get help to have someone point you in that right direction, because more often than not everyone can have that conversation with their partner. They may try, but their partner may not want to listen to them and they butt heads and they can't agree on things. So having a third-party objective person in the room to provide a little bit of coaching, ask perhaps more challenging or difficult questions, and have give both people a voice in the room to say how they're feeling and what they want. Because those conversations, you'd be surprised. It sounds silly, but a lot of the time, I'll hear it across the table from husband and wife. Either the husband or wife, one of them will say something and the other went, I never even knew that. I never knew that was important to you.
Absolutely. Or it triggers and pushes their buttons as well. And it comes back to what we discussed right at the beginning of the podcast today, that money's not talked about because there's emotional baggage there. And the sooner that we can kind of dissolve it or acknowledge it and kind of let it dissipate, then the more productive the conversations can be. That is great advice, mate. Thank you. Did we get 3? I didn't know if we got 1, 2 or 3 there.
I think that was 3. I think one was, it was sit down and map out what your financial position looks like. Step 2, during that same, call it dinner over a bottle of wine, talk about what the goalpost is, what's important to you both. And then 3, reach out and get third-party guidance.
Koda Capital, we'll leave all the details somewhere in the podcast, but basically is there kodacapital.com? What's the actual website? What's your email?
Yeah, that's our website, but my email is jordan.ryan@kodacapital.com. Like you said, you'll put it in the show notes, I'm sure. Yeah. But I also do a lot of people want to follow me on LinkedIn as well, which is just first name, last name. So Jordan Ryan. I post every week talking about essentially what we've spoken about here. sharing some of the investment opportunities that we're getting access to, talking about private equity, talking about business sales. So, you touched on it earlier, that how do people start? Do they listen to podcasts? That's one avenue, like this podcast. Also reading things. So if people want, bite-sized pieces of content, I do a weekly post so they can follow me there.
Nice, digestible, easy to get there, to download metaphorically, but yeah, nice. Jordan, I can't thank you enough for coming on here today, mate. This has been awesome. We're very excited to get you back again in 6 months. I think we really would love to have someone regularly talking about wealth creation and finance. So if you're keen, we'd love to get you back in about 6 months' time and see what's happening in the world in between. Thank you so much for your time. Any final comments to the listeners? Or
no final comments, just looking forward to catching up again in 6 to 12 months.
Awesome, mate. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.